If you've spent really any time on the internet, you've almost certainly run across memes, videos, or references to Australia losing the Great Emu War. Now, this conflict pitted Australia's army against a veritable onslaught of living dinosaurs. 6-foot-tall, 100-pound birds with talons on each foot and a knack for destroying farmland. But what if I were to tell you that just about everything you've learned about this conflict is bunk? In fact, while the Great Emu War, if you could even call it that, really did happen, Australia definitely didn't lose it. Now, I realize that diving into a topic like this is a bit out of the ordinary for an airplane nerd like me. After all, emus can't even fly. But I've been looking for a reason to dispel this myth for years, and the recent one-sided beef between Australia and the United States to surface on the tail end of the Olympics seems like the perfect time to extend the olive branch out to our Aussie allies. So let's talk about the Great Emu War of 1932. What actually happened, and why Australia definitely came out on top. And maybe we can even learn a bit about media literacy along the way. I'm Alex Hollings, and this is Firepower. War Thunder is the biggest, most comprehensive vehicle combat game ever made, and you can play it for free on your PC, your PlayStation, or your Xbox. This game puts you in control of over 2,500 different vehicles and platforms, including helicopters, ships, tanks, and of course, airplanes, ranging from biplanes in the 1920s to the most advanced fighter jets of today. And you can completely immerse yourself in the intense combat of War Thunder thanks to its highly detailed vehicles, its realistic graphics, and even its authentic sound effects, all meant to make you feel like you're at the helm of the most powerful war machines this planet has ever seen. And if you want to get in on the War Thunder action today, you will not be alone. You'll be joining the more than 70 million players worldwide who have already delved into the breathtaking experience that is War Thunder. With an unmatched wealth of high-quality content to discover, there's really just no better game out there for military technology nerds. And that's thanks in no small part to the fact that War Thunder has the most sophisticated vehicle damage modeling in gaming. Every vehicle is intricately designed down to its individual components, like engines, fuel tanks, weapons, even crew members. And the different equipment you use, the different weapons you leverage, they all function just like their real-world counterparts. And if you're not accustomed to this sort of massive PvP play, don't sweat it, because War Thunder offers 3 different gaming modes for different types of players, each one ramping up that realism. You can start in arcade mode with simplified physics and enhanced vehicle performance. And when you're ready, you can step up to the middle ground of realistic mode, which offers a balance of that arcade-style intensity with a big injection of that War Thunder authenticity. Or you could just ditch all the guardrails and jump straight into simulator mode for the most intense and realistic vehicle combat you can find in gaming. And best of all, you can do it for free. You can play War Thunder right now on your PC, your PlayStation, or your Xbox without paying a dime. In fact, if you're a new player or you just haven't played in 6 months, I can get you a massive bonus pack just for following the link in the description below or in the pinned comment below that. Just follow that link and sign up to get a bunch of premium vehicles, the Eagle of Valor exclusive vehicle decorator, 100,000 silver lions to spend on whatever you want, and 7 days of a premium account. Now, this deal's only available for a limited time, so make sure you follow that link today to get in on the War Thunder action. Throughout the 2024 Olympics, something of a one-sided beef between Australians and Americans emerged online, with many Aussies taking to social media to voice their general disdain for the United States and its annoying habit of absolutely dominating the global games. This outpouring of disrespect from our allies down under came as something of a shock to many Americans who overwhelmingly hold both the nation and its people in a generally high esteem. resulting in the heavy use of that phrase, one-sided beef, to denote the unilateral nature of Australia's sour grapes. But the truth is, Australia's population of some 26 million people couldn't possibly be entirely represented by the smattering of heated content creators pouring into our collective news feeds. The inherent nature of modern social media, which incentivizes and intentionally monetizes controversy and conflict, plays directly into a form of digital survivorship bias, wherein we base our opinions about very real topics, issues, and even people on little more than the online hyperbole of content creators. This issue certainly isn't relegated to relations between countries. Online content needs to grab your attention in order to be profitable, and as such, entire economies have sprouted up around the hot take, wherein creators defy common consensus or seemingly reasonable expectations to secure a tight grip on the audience's attention. This model was perhaps best exemplified by websites like my personal favorite, Cracked.com, back in the early 2000s, as they went out of their way to counter the pervasive narratives of the generations that came before, bringing pseudo-historical and often overly simplistic takes to the mainstream, like the idea that the Soviet Union could have won World War II all on its own. Now, historically speaking, that's a pretty silly take, but in the era of edgy online content, it was a perfectly suited narrative to go viral. And America's involvement in securing victory in World War II, which included things like the Lend-Lease Act that equipped the Soviet Union to fight, is certainly not the only event to be robbed of its historical context and nuance in favor of a more viral narrative. After all, just last year, we saw news outlets all over the world report on a US Air Force rogue AI that allegedly killed its operators when they got in the way of completing its mission, despite the fact that the whole story came from a single source with no evidence and actually turned out to be nothing more than a hypothetical thought exercise. But when it comes to meme-ification of military stories, there is one that reigns silliest of all. The time Australia lost the Great Emu War of 1932. And I say emu very intentionally because every fiber of my American being wants to pronounce these birds as emu. But I figure the least I can do is pronounce it the way the Aussies would prefer, as an olive branch to extend after the TikToks I posted comparing the dance moves of Australian breakdancer Rachel Gunn to the super maneuverability of Russian thrust vectoring fighters. I mean, they are both interesting to watch perform and can certainly do things that I can't, but in a real competition against real competitors, neither stand much of a chance of going home with a medal. So as a show of this continued goodwill toward our Australian allies, in this moment of heightened online tensions, let's finally set the record straight on what really went down between the government of Australia and these living dinosaurs. Because, and you likely won't be surprised to hear this, the Great Emu War memes have really missed the mark. And in the big picture, Australia definitely won this war. But to understand how and why, we need to go back to the closing days of World War I, when Australia found itself in some trouble. As the Great War came to a close, Australia faced a slew of massive challenges. The first was just finding a way to get its boys home. With roughly 150,000 troops stuck waiting for spaces on ships amid a global shipping shortage, many were stuck waiting months after the war ended in Britain and the Middle East before finally starting their voyage. The Great War, as it was known, officially ended on November 11th, 1918, but the last transport packed full of Aussie troops didn't make it back down under until September of the following year. But the challenges didn't end when these brave troops finally made it back to their home soil, because now Australia needed to find something to do with its new population of roughly 264,000 war-hardened veterans, as well as the 20,000 or so wives, fiancés, and children these troops had accumulated along the way. With a national population of only around 5 million people at the time, the challenges of veteran reintegration spread throughout every aspect of Australian culture, as the nation mourned its 60,000 dead and attempted to meet the medical and support needs of some 156,000 troops that had been wounded, gassed, or taken prisoner during the war. Nearly 40% of Australian men aged 18 to 44 enlisted to fight, and as a result, many communities were left almost entirely bereft of working-age men at a time when cultural norms saw them as a family's breadwinner. Widows and women married to permanently disabled veterans entered the workforce to make ends meet, which created tensions with backward-looking traditionalists. While some women had no hope of finding a spouse in their own communities, others saw the opportunity to escape bad situations amid the shifting post-war culture, and nationwide, divorce rates doubled. And to make matters all the worse, a breakout of Spanish flu that may have originated in the western front of the war quickly spread into a global pandemic as the world's troops sailed home. And while coming down with the flu might sound like a pleasant alternative to the trench foot and nerve gas these troops left behind, the pandemic soon proved to be much worse, ultimately claiming as many as 5 times as many people as the Great War itself, with estimates ranging from between 50 million and 100 million dead the world over. And as we've learned firsthand in recent years with COVID-19, the intensive quarantine procedures put into place only months after Australian troops returned home only further exacerbated cultural tensions. Well aware that things would only get worse unless something changed, the Australian government kicked off a series of campaigns aimed at equipping able-bodied veterans to support themselves, perhaps best exemplified by the Soldier Settlement Scheme, which saw some 40,000 Aussie vets given small parcels of land at subsidized costs, as long as they promised to farm that land, build a fence around it, and make their homes within it. But well-intentioned as this idea may have been, it came with problems of its own. Many of these vets lacked a basic understanding of agriculture or the skills needed to farm. Many of the small plots of land awarded to these men had poor soil quality or were just too small for a viable farming business. Many of these veterans-turned-farmers lacked the capital they needed to buy the tools necessary to do the job. And to make matters all the worse, fluctuations in the rapidly changing post-war agricultural market meant that even some successful farmers quickly ran out of money just because they had chosen the wrong crop to grow. And things would really only get tougher from there. By 1920, the Australian government had purchased some 90,000 hectares, or roughly 222,400 acres of land to be distributed to these veterans. But with the Soldier Settlement Scheme in full swing, the government still needed more. And before long, they started settling veterans in the difficult terrain of Perth in Western Australia, which only made the challenges associated with starting these farmsteads from scratch even worse. The poor quality soil in Perth made growing anything really difficult, and just as many farmers were starting to actually get their proverbial feet under them, the Great Depression kicked off in 1929, wreaking havoc on the agricultural markets that these families relied on to survive. But while the challenges of economics can sometimes seem ethereal, the new farmers of Western Australia were soon facing a very different and much more in-their-face kind of problem. The kind that can stand over 6 feet tall, weigh in at more than 120 pounds, and run faster than 30 miles per hour, with 3 massive claws on each foot meant for eviscerating foes. Thousands of emus soon descended on these farms in Western Australia, attempting to reclaim the territories that had once been theirs alone. Of course, these Aussie homesteaders may not have had much experience farming, but they definitely knew how to fight. And as these giant birds continued to lay waste to their crops, the farmers fought back. In a chorus of precision gunfire let loose by trained riflemen turned farmers, Thousands of emus fell over the span of years. Bounties were placed on these dino bird beaks, adding further incentive to Australia's trained marksmen, but there were just too many of them. Before long, ammunition was getting sparse, leaving these farmers with really no viable means of engaging the emu onslaught, which by 1932 saw the flightless bird population swell to over 20,000 in this region. And that is when the Australian Army was called in to help. But the deployed force was probably not quite what you'd imagine. Now, when you hear the Great Emu War, you might think that Australia sent a massive force to Perth in an effort to beat back the invading bird hordes, but in reality, it was 3 guys. Well, not just any guys, but rather Major Gwynedd Purves Wyn Aubrey Meredith of the 7th Heavy Battery of the Australian Royal Artillery, and 2 machine gun-toting troops, Sergeant S. McMurray and Gunner J. O'Halloran. Meredith's emu hunters arrived on the scene on November 2nd of 1932, in what was less a large-scale military operation and more what Australian historian Dr. Murray Johnson would later describe as a propaganda exercise. Armed with just 2 Lewis guns, light machine guns chambered in .303, and 10,000 rounds of ammunition, this army detachment set off with the goal of quickly gunning down large numbers of emus as they gathered in herds, and thus lightening the load for local farmers. The first skirmish saw the gunners approach a group of 50 or so birds, milling about from behind. They set up their weapons and commenced firing, assuming the birds would be so utterly surprised by the attack that they could make short work of the whole pack. But instead, the emus panicked, dispersing wildly in all directions and shifting the engagement from an easy enough spray and pray event into trying to rapidly engage dozens of targets, each running at roughly 30 miles per hour in different directions. The results were not quite what Meredith had hoped, but the Australian Army is no stranger to adjusting fire as needed. So, 2 days later, the group had identified a massive pack of more than 1,000 emus gathered together in a loose mob. They silently crept up on the pack, closing to within point-blank range with one of the Lewis guns. And all at once, the gunner opened fire, almost instantly dropping 10 to maybe even 12 of these large birds, only for the weapon to jam, as the mass of feathers and meat flew into another chaotic retreat. And it was at about this time that the Australian media really caught wind of this emu offensive, dubbing it a war on the emu in newspapers all around the country, in much the same way today's media would look for an entertaining and engaging angle, regardless of the actual scope of the operation. That's right, if you needed any confirmation, this sort of hyperbolic and sensationalized media coverage is not specific to our current time or to the United States. It's really been a facet of media since, well, media's inception. And journalists didn't stop there. They even went on to not only anthropomorphize these giant birds as though they were a crafty and cunning adversary in their coverage, but they even went so far as to attribute the idea of a military-like command structure within bird groups. I'll even read you a portion of one of these articles from an Australian newspaper in 1932. The emus have proved that they are not so stupid as they are usually considered to be. Each mob has its leader, always an enormous black-plumed bird standing fully 6 feet high, who keeps watch while his fellows busy themselves with the wheat. At the first suspicious sign, he gives the signal, and dozens of heads stretch up out of the crop. A few birds will take fright, starting a headlong stampede for the scrub, the leader always remaining until his fellows have reached safety. As the media hyperbole machine went wild with tales from the front lines of the new Great Emu War, Meredith and his 2 men experimented with other means of engaging these flightless birds. At one point, they tried to shoot the birds from moving trucks, but found that it was too difficult to aim the Lewis guns on the move. So instead, they just ran one of them over, though that seems to have been an accident, but it nonetheless got tangled in the truck's suspension, causing the truck to veer off the road and damage a fence. By November 8th, 6 days after the first engagement of this Great Emu War, Meredith reported that they had expended roughly 2,500 rounds from their Lewis guns, about 25% of all the ammunition allotted to this effort. But with a firing rate of around 550 rounds per minute, that was the equivalent of about 4.5 minutes worth of sustained fire from one weapon, spread out over the span of a week. Not much of a war. But the media firestorm was not going to let up, and it was already seeping into politics. One Labour politician from New South Wales was quoted in a newspaper as asking if, quote, a medal was to be struck for those taking part in this war, only for another politician in Western Australia to publicly respond that any medals should rightly go to the emus who have, quote, won every round so far. After a month of action, Meredith reported that his team was downing around 100 emus a week, a much slower pace than expected at the onset of the operation, but steady progress nonetheless. But he also reported that his team was expending an average of 10 rounds for every downed bird, and for some reason, that was perceived as a really big problem. A Lewis gun, after all, sends that many rounds downrange per second. But based on the way the media in Australia reported on this revelation, you'd think the emus were downright bulletproof. Even 20 years later, Australian news outlets like the Sun Herald were still recounting this fact as though it was proof of the giant bird's invulnerability to gunfire. I'll quote the Sun Herald here. If we had a military division with the bullet-carrying capacity of these birds, it would face any army in the world. They can face machine guns with the invulnerability of tanks. They are like Zulus, who even dum-dum bullets could not stop. That quote was attributed to Meredith by the Sun Herald, but has since been attributed to others in other sources, so its veracity could certainly be in question. And of course, expending an average of 10 rounds per emu did not mean these birds were bulletproof. As is the case anytime you use automatic weapons to hit moving targets, a lot of those rounds never hit a bird at all. Nonetheless, thus ended Australia's military offensive in the Great Emu War of 1932. 3 guys, 2 machine guns, and 10,000 rounds. Here in the United States, that might sound like a Friday night to some of you out there, but what started as just a little PR exercise for the military had spiraled into a national scandal that would go on to become a global joke. And this is where pop culture tales of the Great Emu War tend to come to a close. But in reality, the veteran farmers of Western Australia were still left dealing with thousands of emus wreaking havoc on their farms and their livelihoods. And the Australian government wasn't just going to leave them out to dry. Instead, they decided to do what the veterans asked of them in the first place and began providing them ammunition to handle the emu pests themselves. And that's exactly what they did. Starting in 1934, Australia's veteran farmers dusted off their rifles and went to work, wiping out more than 57,000 emus from their land in just under 6 months, winning a significant victory in this Great Emu War that went entirely unreported. And while I wouldn't argue that human beings wiping out tens of thousands of birds is a happy ending worthy of a front-page story, the fact that this part of the Great Emu War narrative has been forgotten to time is not a coincidence. It's a very intentional narrative decision, because Australia losing the Great Emu War is a story you'll click on. But human beings using tools to demonstrate their position at the top of the food chain is the same old song and dance we've seen since the very beginning of human history. Though, to be fair, this conflict between farmers in Western Australia and the emu did continue on and off for years to come. Every so often, the emu population would surge, and the farmers would request more support, though those requests were often denied. And these sporadic spurts of emu aggression continued until 1955, when the war was brought to a permanent close with the construction of a fence. Now, that fence was certainly controversial, as it impeded the natural migration patterns of not just the emu, but many other animals. But nonetheless, it did end the problem for these farmers in Perth. And then in 1999, one could argue that Australia truly came out on top when the Australian government signed the Environment Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act into law, which, among other things, made Australia's wild emus a formally protected species. Now, the internet may want you to believe that the Aussies lost the Great Emu War, but if you ask me, you'll be hard-pressed to find any conflict in history where the alleged losers had to pass laws to protect the surviving victors from incurring any further losses. So the next time you see a meme about the Great Emu War, or you see a commenter under an Australian creator's video telling them that their country lost a war to birds, you should know that what you're seeing are the long-term effects of irresponsible media practices, not a recounting of true events, not a retelling of history, but a meme for meme's sake. And this lesson has parallels all throughout the modern world, where all of us, Australians, Americans, and everyone else, learn about the world beyond our horizons through these little glass boxes we hold in our hands or mount on our walls. And it is vitally important for us to come to understand that often what we see through these little electronic windows is not reality, but is rather a funhouse mirror reflection through the lens of hyperbole and sensationalism meant to provoke an emotional response strong enough to get you to click, or to comment, or to share. And while it might even be kind of funny when we're talking about our Aussie friends losing a war to dino birds, it becomes a lot less funny real fast when these same meme-ification tactics are applied to contemporary people, policy, and conflict, where real people right now are losing their lives. So when it comes to staying informed in the contested digital battle spaces of modern media and the flood of memes on every topic on every social media platform, when you get information from a meme and you aren't certain of the source, you should always rely on the Ferengi rule of acquisition number 190. Hear all, but trust nothing. Before we close, I just want to say thanks to War Thunder one more time for sponsoring this video. Don't forget that you can play War Thunder for free on PC, PlayStation, or Xbox right now by following the link in the description below. And if you're a new player or you just haven't played in 6 months, you can get a massive bonus pack across all platforms, including multiple premium vehicles and a bunch of other goodies. And again, this deal's only available for a limited time, so make sure to follow that link to use it before you lose it. And with that ends this edition of Firepower from Sandboxx News. I'm Alex Hollings. Make sure to swing by sandboxnews.com today and every day for all the latest in news, entertainment, and motivation from all around the force. If you got anything out of today's video, make sure to click like and subscribe down below, and leave me a comment so I know what I should cover next. And of course, don't forget to tap on that bell icon so you never miss a drop from Sandboxx News.